Hey everyone, it's Jenny at JC Cards. Today I've created 3 cards, all of which focus on pastel coloured backgrounds. I'm using different mediums including watercolour, alcohol inks and pattern paper, along with heat embossing to create these soft and pretty cards. I also wanted to focus on paper or cardstock that you wouldn't necessarily normally heat emboss on to show you that it can be done. So first off, we're doing watercolour, and I'm using this handmade watercolour paper from Hero Arts, which is very textured. I'm also going to be using this opaque vanilla white regular grade embossing powder from Wow. I'm really into the different shades of white that Wow created right now. There's a number of others such as Seafoam, and they're all tinted slightly differently. This one has, as it sounds like, a hint of vanilla. It's slightly yellow, but it's very subtle. So to start off with, I've taken some of the watercolour cardstock and I've put it in my MISTI. This is because we're going to need to ink up and stamp twice or 3 times with what is very textured cardstock. I'm inking up this background stamp. It's by Catherine Pooler Designs and it's the Cottage Garden background stamp. It's quite detailed and I wanted to use this as a true test of whether I could get a good clear impression on my very textured watercolour cardstock. I'm stamped it down 3 times and now I'm going to be heat embossing it with the embossing powder. I like to use a coffee filter just to catch the grains, which is easy enough to funnel back into the tubs. And then I'm using my Wow dual heat embossing tool. I'm using it on setting 1 just because I didn't want to damage this watercolour paper and I wanted to avoid the embossing powder sinking in. So just as it goes shiny, I remove my tool. I'm now using this butcher's palette. It's a metal tray. You can use it for alcohol inks, you can use it for paint. It just keeps in a lot of the mess, and because it's white I can see what colours I'm using. So I'm using distress inks to watercolour with. I've got milled lavender, spun sugar, tumbled glass and shaded lilac. They're all very soft pastely colours and I've smushed them around all over the tray, and then I'm adding quite a bit of water here with my sprayer. I'm then dunking in the watercolour cardstock and pushing down. I'm going to then lift it back up, see if it gives me what I want, and if not, I'll dunk it back in again until I'm happy. And what you find is the embossing powder resists the ink and you can then heat dry it. I would recommend setting 1 again on your heat tool or leave it to dry naturally, and you're left with pools of the ink colour in between the patterns. Now I did this 2 or 3 times, I think it was 3 times, just to get the layer on layer look of the inks, and when I was done you get this very soft pretty background. You can of course do this with Distress Oxides, other watercolour paints. I wanted a really soft colour background. And I didn't show it on camera, but I did also wipe away the ink where it was blending together on the palette and re-add in my ink pads just so that I could add a little bit more of the blue or a little bit more of the spun sugar. And you know, these palettes are great actually for that. I also went in just to highlight a bit more of the area of the background stamp, so I smushed my inks back into the palette again, and I'm using a water brush here just to paint in really loosely in some of the areas where I didn't think the ink kind of picked up enough of the image. And I then left it to dry, and I was really pleased how detailed this came out. It worked really well. I'm now using this Erin Lee Creative You Are Sweet die. I have die cut it 3 times and stacked them together from pink shimmer cardstock, and then I'm just going to glue that onto the centre of my background panel and add a few sequins. I also added some Fairy Wings Dream Drops, and the sentiment is from an Altenew stamp set called Just Because, which I stamped with Rose Petals ink by Catherine Pooler because I thought it went really well with the colours. So for my next card we're going to be using patterned paper. I have tons and tons of patterned paper. I hoard it, and this is one of my favourite pads. You can see it's a bit well loved. It's Blush and Mint by, I think it's the Michael's Recollections collection, or Reflections collection I should say, and I've die cut a panel of it using a rectangular die and put it into my mini MISTI. I love heat embossing on patterned paper. You get some amazing effects. You can choose detailed stamps over wide open image patterned paper, or like this one is quite a detailed but subtle background image on the patterned paper, and I'm adding another detailed stamp. This is one of the main images from Just Because by Altenew over the top of it. but I thought they went really well together, and I also like the way the colours tied in with the other two cards I've created in this video. I've treated it with my powder tool, I've stamped it down in Wow embossing ink, and then I'm heat embossing it in Wow metallic silver superfine embossing powder. I went with the superfine here because it's a very detailed image with a lot of fine lines, and I wanted to make sure I didn't lose any of that. And then I'm heat embossing it. I am using setting 2, but depending on the thickness of the paper, you may want to be careful, maybe move around your heat tool so you avoid burning it or warping the paper too much. Now to finish the card, I have backed it onto a white note card. I'm using this strong die by Hutson, which I've die cut from thick white cardstock and stacked it up 4 times. I'm then going to use this sentiment again from the Just Because set by Altenew, but the stamp has actually got the main sentiment over the top of it, which I don't want. So I'm using my cutter beads and I'm just going to snip them apart. You can always put them back together again if you need to at another time. And I'm going to stamp this directly onto the pattern paper. I'm using VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a superfine black ink. And when you're stamping onto pattern paper directly, I highly recommend using a stamp positioning tool. A couple of times I've used acrylic blocks or just eyeballed it and I accidentally smudged it. And then I had to do the old pop something up over the top to hide your mistakes. So this time I'm using my Misty. I've stamped the sentiment and I've added the strong with some liquid adhesive underneath. And then I'm just going to, for a final embellishment, add some Nouveau crystal gems directly onto the pattern paper, and that finishes the card. I highly recommend stamping and heat embossing directly onto pattern paper. It's a great use of your stash and you come up with some beautiful cards in relatively little effort. They're really good for having a quick card to hand when you need to. Now for my third card I'm using alcohol inks, and this is Yupo paper. It is plastic. It doesn't like heat very much. I highly recommend, if you're going to be doing heat embossing on Yupo paper, to use the heavyweight Yupo. I've used the lighter weight in the past and I ended up with what looked like a shrinky dink. So I'm going to show you some tips here as well, just to how to get a good image with your heat embossing. But first off, we've got to create our background. So I've put the Yupo into my butcher's palette. I've added a lot of alcohol ink blending solution over the top, and then I'm dropping in some inks. I'm using some pretty pastel colours again, pink sherbet, salmon, cloudy blue I think I'm using, and then I'm using this it's a Tim Holtz distress marker spritzer. You can get little air pump things as well, and you just blow the blending solution and the ink around and it dries the ink and the solution, pushes it around, you get that really pretty ethereal soft look. Now I didn't die cut this first with my rectangle die before I put it in my Misty because I wasn't quite sure which part of the background I was going to use. I've pulled off my image. This is from a Miss Ink stamp set called Magnolia Sympathy. That's the main image, and I placed it over the background where I thought it would look good when I die cut it. I'm inking it up with the embossing ink, and I am treating that Yupo paper with my powder tool as well, just to make sure we don't get embossing powder sticking where we don't want it. I'm then going to be heat embossing it with Wow Metallic Rich Pale Gold, which is a really kind of beautiful and almost antique-y gold powder. It's one of my favourites. This is the regular, so it's not the super fine. It wasn't a particularly detailed image. And I'm tipping it over the cardstock just in the same way that we would emboss on anything else. Other than using the heavyweight Yupo, the trick to emboss successfully on Yupo is to keep moving your heat gun away. So you blast it with a little bit of heat and then move it away. Let it cool slightly, blast it with a little bit of heat, let it cool down slightly, move it away. It takes a lot longer, but you end up with much less warping. And I'll just show you, once this is finished, you can see how pretty it looks. And then if I just give you a side shot, you can see that actually there was very little warping in using this method. Now for my sentiment, I'm using this set from Birch Press Design, which is called Hooray for Everything. I'm using one of the larger words which have coordinating dies, and I'm also using one of the sub-sentiments, and I'm heat embossing it in the exact same powder that I used for the Magnolia stamp so that they coordinate well together. I'm stamping it down onto, this is just Wow embossing cardstock, which I haven't used for the majority of my cards. That's because I was using different mediums, but for plain white cardstock for heat embossing, this is really good. It heat embosses with very little to no warping. And I'm just going to die cut out the congrats sentiment with the coordinating die. I'm popping it up on foam tape. These are Doris foam strips, along with the sentiment that I've cut out, and popped it over the bottom of the Magnolia and adding a few of those sequins again, and that finishes my card. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. It first appeared over on the Wow Embossing channel. I'd love it if you'd subscribe to my channel and ring that bell to be reminded when there's a new video. Here's a couple of other videos you might enjoy. Have an awesome day. Bye.